The Richardson Gang was an English crime gang based in South London, England, in the 1960s, also known as a torture gang. They had a reputation of some of London's most sadistic gangsters. Their alleged specialities include pulling teeth with pliers, cutting off toes using bolt cutters, and nailing victims to the floor using 6-inch nails. Charles and Eddie Richardson. Charlie Richardson was born in Brentford, Middlesex, to Eileen Elizabeth Mary and Charles Frederick Richardson, who married the previous year in Camberwell, South London. The family soon moved back to Camberwell, where younger brother Eddie Richardson was born in 1936, followed by youngest sibling Alan. Charlie and Eddie turned to a life of crime after their father deserted the family. George Cornell. An important member of the Richardson Gang was George Cornell. Cornell was heavily involved in drug dealing in Purple Hearts and Dexies, uppers, downers and cannabis. He was also involved in pornography and may have been associated with Jimmy Humphreys, who was responsible for the exposure of corrupt police officials in 1971, including Commander Ken Drury of the Flying Squad. Humphreys was under investigation by another squad, and Drury refused to acknowledge his association with Humphreys even after Drury reportedly received a "Wish You Were Here" holiday postcard from him. Cornell was originally a member of the East End gang called the Watney Streeters and later became involved with the Krays. However, he changed sides in around 1964 and allied himself with the Richardsons. Cornell was unstable, unpredictable, and nearly caused an all-out war between the two gangs before his death when Ronnie Kray shot and killed him in 1966. Mad Frankie Fraser. Frankie Fraser teamed up with the Richardson Gang in the 1960s. His criminal career began at 13 with theft. During the Second World War, his crimes escalated, including shopbreaking and desertion. He was a known associate of gangster Billy Hill throughout the 1950s. After joining the Richardsons, he served as their enforcer. Reportedly, Fraser's favourite brand of punishment was extracting teeth with pliers. Over his long criminal career, Fraser spent 40 to 42 years in prison. He died in 2014 of natural causes. Notable characters in the gang included the hitman Jimmy Moody, Roy Hall, who operated the electric generator, Bartholomew Barry Harris, who was a getaway driver for the gang, Albert Longman, Alan Rigby, Frank Bailey, and Tommy Clark. Criminal activity. Charlie invested in scrap metal, whilst Eddie operated fruit machines. These businesses were fronts for the underworld activities, which included fraud, racketeering, usury, theft, and stolen goods. Eddie would, on occasion, suggest that a pub landlord should buy one of his slot devices. Failure to do so meant running the risks of being beaten and the pub being vandalised. Charlie was at one point arrested for receiving stolen goods, but was acquitted through lack of evidence and, allegedly, with the help of a large donation to the police fund. Fraud. They preferred investing in fraud schemes known as long firms. A company would be set up by an acquaintance who was well paid for the prison term he might eventually serve. The company would conduct normal business for some months, building lines of credit and winning the trust of suppliers. Eventually, they would place a large order on credit. The goods would then be sold for cash, the money pocketed, and the company and those involved in running it would eventually disappear. Mock trials and torture. The Richardson Gang frequently used mock trials to punish transgressors and intimidate others. The accused were hauled in front of Charlie, Fraser, and others in the Kangaroo Court. After the mock trial, the punishments were meted out. ranging anything from beatings to more severe forms of torture, such as whippings, cigarette burning, teeth being pulled with pliers, for which Fraser was especially notorious, nailing to the floor, having toes removed with bolt cutters, and giving electric shocks until unconscious. The electric shocks were inflicted by an old army field telephone, which included a hand crank powered generator. Much like the notorious Tucker telephone, the terminals were attached to the victim's nipples and genitalia and were then placed in a bath of cold water to enhance the electrical charge. After trial and punishment, victims who were too badly injured would be sent to a doctor who had been struck off the medical register. This process of trial and torture was known as taking a shirt from Charlie, because Charlie Richardson's habit of giving each victim a clean shirt in which to return home, since the victim's original shirt was usually covered in blood. On one occasion, a collector of pensions, which is protection money from publicans and others, was punished after being twice warned by the Richardsons for pocketing the money and spending it at Catford Dodd Track. He was nailed to the floor of the warehouse near Tower Bridge for nearly 2 days, during which time gang members, for example driver Harry Beard, frequently urinated on him. In later years, however, Frankie Fraser claimed that the charges of torture were exaggerated. He cried rubbish to stories of electrified genitals. In reference to the allegation of foot nailing and tooth removals, he said that it was all false. Today, we wouldn't even have been charged, let alone gone to prison. The Richardson Gang and the Krays twins were engaged in a turf war in the mid to late 1960s. Charlie Richardson and George Cornell had first met the Krays while in Shepton Mallet Prison. Tensions came to a head in 1965-66 during a Christmas party at the Astor Club in December 1965. Cornell called Ronnie Kray a fat puff and a fight ensued. On the 7th or the 8th of March in 1966, Richard Hart, one of the Krays associates, was shot dead, intentionally or otherwise, during a brawl at Mr. Smith's club in Rushley Green, Catford. Mr. Smith's was owned by Manchester-based businessmen Dougie Flood and Billy Benny. They asked Eddie Richardson and Frankie Fraser to protect the club in exchange for gaming machines being placed there. On the night in question, both groups were drinking and chatting quite happily. That, according to a guest who was with his girlfriend at the bar but suddenly ushered out of the club soon after midnight. At around 1 a.m, Eddie Richardson told Peter Hennessy and others to drink up and leave. In response, Hennessy called Eddie Richardson a half-baked fucking ponce and shouting that he could take you any fucking time. Richardson and Hennessy began exchanging blows. Other fistfight had started in the club when gunshots rang out. Several years after the incident, an unnamed gangster who was at the club at the time said it was like Dodge City. It was said that Hart was shot on or near the bottom of the stairs as he was making his getaway. For many years, Fraser was held responsible for murdering Hart. Fraser always vehemently denied it, and it was alleged that Billy Gardner confronted Fraser, asking, "You've tooled up Frank," and shot Fraser through the thigh with a .38 pistol. Eddie Richardson, Frankie Fraser, and others ended up in Lewisham Hospital. They denied all knowledge of the incident. Shooting? What shooting? When questioned by the police. Hennessy sustained a bayonet wound to his scalp. Hennessy, Gardner and others sought help from Freddie Foreman after the allocation. Although most of the gang were arrested, some were put up by Foreman until things had blown over. Fraser had been officially declared insane at least twice previously. It's been suggested though that Frankie acquired his Mad Frankie from this incident. Apparently, a Hayward associate named Henry Bottom saw Fraser kicking Hart in the head and shouted, You're fucking mad, Frank. You're fucking bonkers. Fallout continued the next day. A member of the Richardson Gang, Jimmy Andrews, was injured in the affray and went for treatment at Whitechapel Hospital the day after. This was where George Cornell, an old friend of Andrews, went to visit him. That evening, about 8:30, Cornell was inside the Blind Beggar public house. Ronnie Kray arrived with 2 associates and shot Cornell through the head at close range. One of several local businessmen in the saloon bar at the time said he heard Cornell's last words, "Well, look what the dog brought in." The Krays and the Richardsons lived parallel lives in many respects. Both were working class brothers with little formal education. Both had dodgy fathers who ended up deserting them as boys. And they were both good at boxing and got into scrapes. As men, they beat up other men and got into scams, and all spent several decades in prison. Unlike their infamous counterparts, Charlie and Eddie Richardson were not national names in their heyday. They didn't go in for having their photograph taken for the papers with the likes of Bob Lord Boothby. But in their own world, the Richardsons were everything the Krays were, and more. If anything, they were even more dangerous to cross. Their wider notoriety came via the so-called torture trial of 1967, of which the grisly details still resonate. Mad Frankie Fraser pulling out victims' teeth with pliers, the black box with the wind-up handles that directed electricity through the genitals, and perhaps most chillingly, Charlie sending out for fish and chips when he got peckish in the middle of a torture session. Before their downfall, the Richardsons and their henchmen were the English Goodfellas. They dined in fine restaurants, dressed elegantly, and extruded a spurious glamour that made stars such as Stanley Baker and Deanna Dawes want to befriend them. All of it, however, was bought with violence. The downfall of the Richardsons came about because of the highly public nature of the Mr. Smith's Club incident and because of mounting testimony to the police. In July 1965, one of the gang's victims reported the crime to the police. The victim told the tale of being severely beaten and bruised after being found guilty of disloyalty by a kangaroo court. He then had to mop up his own blood using his underpants. A member of the Richardson Gang, Johnny Bradbury, turned Queen's evidence. Bradbury was convicted of murdering a business associate named Waldeck in South Africa, allegedly on orders from Charlie Richardson. When sentenced to hang, Bradbury offered to inform on the Richardson Gang in exchange for a pardon and immunity. This was arranged by Special Squad of the CID, led by Inspector Gerald MacArthur. Other victims of the Richardsons were granted immunity from prosecution in other crimes if they turned Queen's evidence. With the assistance of the Home Office, which arranged different identities and passports, several witnesses fled the country immediately after the trial. A few went to South Africa, others went to Spain. Many did not return to the UK for a considerable time. Charlie Richardson was arrested for torture on the 30th of July 1966, the World Cup final day. Eddie Richardson was sent to prison for 5 years for affray. There were also stories of Charlie being connected to the South African Bureau of State Security and an attempt to tap then Prime Minister Harold Wilson's telephone. In July 1966, police arrested the remaining members of the Richardson Gang following a series of raids in South London. The so-called torture trial convened at the Old Bailey at the beginning of April 1967. The Richardsons were found guilty of fraud, extortion, assault, and grievous bodily harm. Charlie Richardson was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and Eddie, 10. Charlie Richardson was not freed until July 1984. In 1980, after many attempts to obtain release, Charlie Richardson escaped from open prison. He went on the trot for almost a year, even dressing as Santa Claus and giving out presents to children to publicise his requests for release. He openly drank with friends and old associates, including police officers, at several pubs at the Old Kent Road before fleeing to Paris, where he gave an interview to a journalist. He was arrested with 5 other men in Earl's Court on suspicion of possession of drugs, having just been seen coming out of a sex shop which was known to be controlled by the Richardson family. His identity only came to light once arrested and in police custody in Kensington, where his probation officer contacted the police, having been informed by other gang members that he'd been arrested. In 1983, Charlie was able to go on day release to help the handicapped and was allowed to spend a weekend with his family. Charlie was finally released in July 1984. In 1990, Eddie Richardson was sentenced to 35 years after being convicted of his involvement in a 70 million cocaine and cannabis heist. He was originally sentenced to 35 years but was released after 12, bringing his total number of years to 23. The brothers fell out badly after Eddie accused Charlie of fraudulent business deals during Eddie's time in prison. Charlie Richardson died of peritonitis in September 2012. A heavy smoker, he suffered from emphysema for several years. And that is the story of the Richardson Gang.